Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 2.5 to 2.8, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 2.5 Rivalry. I'd been left many gifts by our various guests. Kobachan had swept out the nacre spider nests in the sewers, finally retrieving her true haul from the night of the white fires. Dozens of people fleeing in confusion had been snatched up and eaten, leaving behind both the money that had been brought to bid and sometimes the prizes of the auction itself. The kobold spread them out before me in Aram's cavern, the great snake eyeing the golden spoils with interest. Already his hoard was growing, a small pile of jewels taken from the chaos of the auction and from the numerous little heists across the city wrapped up in his scales as I slowly converted them into shards. With the kobold as our hands, we began to examine the yield. A box sealed with a royal cachet of wax yielded a cluster of pale blue stones that, when they came into contact with the air, converted into a fresh, pure rainwater. The moment the box was open, it began to overflow. 3 pouches contained grooved teardrop-shaped seeds the color of a rich earth, which I would grow when I found the appropriate chance. There was sadly no sphinx bone tea set, but I did recover the pair of dice carved out of crocodile bone. A subtle enhancement of luck was imbued into them. As for enchanted blades, I had half a dozen by now. From the snake-curved dagger enhanced by a single rune built into the grip, to a long rapier with a red silk wrapped around the pommel and a beautiful hilt in the shape of a snarling lion's head, my collection would have been the pride of many blacksmiths. Preeminent amongst all of those with the main dagger, that piece of the sky made sharp. But I would never sacrifice that. Most of what I acquired was just tat to be spent, one way or another. The dagger was family, a piece of my creator's mind, a hint at my name. There were 13 pieces in the Master Valhallan's work, 13 after the bells of Kulturn. The main dagger rested in my possession, and there were 11 more scattered in the winds of the city. The final piece had been my own ring. If I knew which bells the other 12 pieces of Valhallan's legacy were named after, the last remaining name would be my own. I had never taken Sufi up on her offer to give me a name. The peasant like her had no right. But if there was any human that I would suffer to name me, it was the master who had crafted my ring. And there was another reason to seek them. I had found a subtle enhancement worked into the main dagger, infused with a faint resonance. It made no sense, had no clear function, but the more I studied it, the more I realized that I was looking at one part of a complex whole. The enchantment split into 13 parts. One fragment of that spell had already been lost with the destruction of my ring, but if I had the other 12, I could perhaps restore the whole. But now I began eating the bastard sword, dissolving away the metal so that the underlying diagrams of spellwork were left behind. They quickly threatened to dissipate into the air without something to anchor to, and so I gave them my mana, creating a cloud of bluish light that the golden design swam through. Evidently, this wasn't enough to form a blessing, so I quickly devoured the rest, letting their designs spill up and join the cloud. Clashing patterns of golden lines kaleidoscoped and rotated, falling into place with one another. As the designs intermeshed, they collapsed, shrinking smaller and smaller, and I condensed the cloud to match, drawing it in. Soon a sphere of blue lined with shifting gold hung in the air above the kobold, like a strange moon. With the final rotation on the diagram seemed to solve themselves, condensing to a single spark and sucking in the last of my mana with them. The spark hovered in the air and slowly drifted towards the kobold, who reached out with his scaly hands. It touched him, and for an instant the golden lines wrapped around his scales, and then they were gone, dissolved into his being. Gold-streaked kobold, forming an attunement with its egg nearby a source of draconic blood. This kobold has taken the draconic traits from Orum, its spiritual sire. It will serve with faith and affection all its life. Blessing of steel. This minion may conjure blades at will, manifesting more powerful ones as its skills in swordsmanship increase. An experiment, it was entirely successful. For practical purposes, I couldn't imagine what this runty little creature would do with such a power. He just seemed to amuse himself with it, conjuring a knife to his hand and then disappearing it. scrambling up to Orm's scales to get a big snake's attention, and he curled up a crude little metal shiv and then made it blink back out of existence. He spread out 4 fingers, hands, as if to say, really was gone, barking in amusement. Rom, to my surprise, humoured him, swaying his head back and forth and peering around all as if confused by the little magic trick. When the knife was made to reappear, his head reeled back in a forked shock. I could have sighed. He really was spoiling the kobold. I had never coddled any of my minions this way. And to be honest, for the moment, I was jealous of the attention the little creature got. He should have known his place, with his runty little blunt nose and unblinking amber eyes. Bah! How about we try not eating this time? Trevelyan suggested as they came upon the table. It was not the first time that he'd made the suggestion, and it was not the first time Umi went on completely to ignore him, grabbing a skewer of fish and ripping away chunks of fried, flaky mahi-mahi. "Gotta eat, keep up her strength," she grunted between bites. Trevelyan sighed. They were trapped in a maze and even shifting assortments of strange blank-white marble hallways, perfectly squared dimensions. The monotony of walking through the endless white made the table's appearance seem like a miracle at first. It was a table laden with every kind of good food, with an enormous roast boar head at its center on a platter lined with carrots and apples, jellies and little cakes, baskets of freshly crumbed bread and pies, sweet and savory, and, oh yes, little cakes again, racks of ribs, bowls full of kidney stew, fresh butter, marmalade, jam. Holding Umi back had been futile. When she seemed unlikely to keel over from poisoning, Trevelyan had joined in. And then, when nothing happened, no terrible death or sudden opening of the door, they continued on their way and left the bones and rinds behind. The next day they found the table again. Its banquet refreshed. The surmise had been that it was to keep them from starving while they navigated the maze. Now Trevelyan wasn't so sure. Yes, but I was thinking, what if we don't? We keep coming back here, and nothing else about this maze changes. What if this is a challenge that we've tried eating, let's try not? I'm starving. How about you can try fasting? Umi suggested, already reaching for the ribs. God, they were delicious too. Trevelyan considered the belly rumbling, and he watched her teeth tear into the tender, blueberry-glazed flesh. I did, yesterday. So then it didn't work. We're still here. Bones littered the ground as she demolished the table, eating like 12 men combined. They were always gone when the 2 returned the next day. Because you ate. Trevelyan's teeth ground together. We both have to try fasting it up. If we ever want to get out of here, what else is there? Going around in circles forever. You make a good point, an excellent point. I'll consider that. Umi said, mouthful. Tomorrow. I'll consider it tomorrow. And she tossed him an apple. Trevelyan grumbled, hiding the sour expression behind a bite of the fruit. Oh, if only he had his usual vial of poison. That would settle this moron. Maybe she was part of the tower's games, and the challenge was not to strangle her. End of chapter. Chapter 2.6 Lures and Traps and Shiny Things. Descending from the stairwell, my dear guests would find themselves at the base of a stone tower, surrounded on all sides by grey fields of endless flowers, the shape of 5-petaled stars repeated on and on into the horizon. The dark was deep, tenebrous, and an inky, almost solid presence that weighed down and that drank up the tiny torches and lanterns that they would bring. And the tiny sphere of what they could view with the trees would loom as skeletal silhouettes, and if they approached, they would see the weeping faces carved into the salt, the way that the red iron underneath shone through in a cloud of crystalline streaks. Vines of flesh would curl around the branches, and a fruit of night vein would tempt them. Of course, one of the vines was a serpent coiled in hibernation. I had simply turned the scales into a deep bloody red, and of course improved its venom. One bite, one unwary hand reaching for the fruit, would be their doom. That would be how my second layer introduced itself. The first plateau was largely empty, choosing instead to rely on the way of the field of flowers stretching over the gap between the islands, their roots interlocking to form a floating canopy over the pitfall. I would let them discover that the hard way. Once they found the bridge across, they would arrive at my second island. Here I was adding elements, upping the challenge. This island would focus not on keeping invaders out, but keeping them in. I wanted them to come far enough into my little world to have no hope to retreat. This was the lair of the rock spiders, that I made them sensitive to particular sound, trained them to rise up from and they're disguised as mere boulders and go into a savage frenzy at a note, the sound of feet crossing the second bridge. Once the adventurers started to move to the third island, the way back would suddenly be cut off, a surge of angry stone spinner spiders blocking their way. They would have no choice but to continue. I laid a second trap near the bridge, a skeletal corpse. While making live humans was beyond my power, making dead ones was simple enough. Lying by the corpse was a scattering of coins and emerald brooch, or what looked like one. It was in fact a disguised snail, a deadly soft-bodied horror of radial gaping mouth lined with sharp little injected teeth, meant to pump a numbing poison into an unwary. The coins were normal enough, since the damned humans made theirs out of dark iron. I couldn't put anything inside without it dying almost immediately. But again, I counted on greed. I had scattered these little beauties throughout my dungeon, and while they might not attract much attention at first, seemingly obviously a trap, a real treasurers and very genuine sets of bones began to litter the ground, and it might become tempting to test one's luck and take from a corpse of adventurers past. But what kind of monster would I be if I stopped there? The third landmass would be where the ground itself turned against them. Step in on the wrong place when a fluttering swarm of hypnotic butterflies would erupt. Razor-sharp vines would wrap around your leg and clutching thorns. Pitfalls abounded, and here I had a genius idea. I made shallow serviceable falls, but layered them with a few species of the summerland bloom schema, more deadly than before. Bone-white and thin as silk, the brushing little hairs would cling to the little sucker-octopus feet or whatever touched them, dripping a steady adhesive. So the prospective victim would fall and be caught fast, screaming off the companions. As if the brave heroes rushed to the hapless fool's aid, they would drink in the invisible, thin cloud of sleeping spores that fell and subsequent struggling had stirred up in the air. Not enough to fell a grown man quickly, but enough to slow his reflexes. In this way, one fool who took a misplaced step could drag his whole team down. As for creatures, it was time that they met a serious resistance. With the way back barred by the angry stone spinners, more of the Goliath spiders would swarm in front. At the center of the island, I would build another gazebo, one made of salt. It would guard the entrance as of a set of concealed tunnels that spread throughout the island, allowing minions to pop up and vanish throughout the holes too small for a grown human to follow. As for who would take up position, I chose a room's cobalt as a base. This was a floor that emphasized skills and wits over brute force, and better yet, their dexterous hands allowed them to wield ranged weaponry for harassing and skirmishing. I made 7 to begin with, one after the other blinking with their wide yellow eyes as they came into existence from clasping clouds of mana. I made each of them a little different, some skinny and quick, others bulky and strong. One I gave a slimy coating of the lamprey and the abyssal shark, a scorpion's tail, 4 eyes, a spider's climbing hairs, and chameleonic skin. For them I made long spears and hollow blowpipes with poisonous darts. The latter was a mistake. The smallest of the kobolds lifted up the hollow wood tube, blowing through it. An empty puffing note burst out. Delighted, it continued to puff away, making an awful little racket. I had made a musician, and no, I could only regret it. Argent was scuffed, shaken, but unarmed. She watched nervously over the breach as the humans swarmed around the new hole in the Maker's works. It was clear that many of them were angry. The breach had ripped down nearby houses, cut the street in half, and claimed lives of people fell into the spreading destruction. Guards in shining breastplates and high-plumed helmets came to seize the mages who hadn't been pulled under by the catastrophic expansion of the spell, dragging them away. Men were posted around the gap, a cordon establishment. It became more and more clear that the city hadn't ordered this. It had been the work of runaway adventurers, too eager for riches and glory. They had gotten what they deserved in the end. One of her best lieutenants had managed to leap from half-collapsed roof down into the top of the governor's carriage. as the man himself arrived to survey the damage. Even for humans he was a giant, a tall and round-bellied man with a bald as an egg, walking with the help of a cane, his fingers laden with rings that clicked on the walking stick's golden grip. He held the silk handkerchief to his face to hold back the slow drift of dust from the ruined homes. The air was thick with ash and smoke from fires that had sprung up under the ruins. Nevertheless, he coughed, bending so far forward that his men seized his arms just to keep him from going over the edge as he hacked up and spat. I want Volgren. Where is he? The captain of the men stepped forward and presented himself, plumed helmet tucked under his arm respectfully. Prepare an expedition force. If this thing is going to live under our city and cause trouble, we should make some profit in it all, don't you think? And tell Avery, no, don't ask her, just tell her. The governor shook his head, hocking a ball of spit over the edge of the crevice. This whole business is disgraceful. Brought out the animals and people. He shook his head, disgusted. Drivlin and Umi slid to a stop. Their bellies were empty. Their heads started to ring and swim from the demands for food. They felt like hollow people. It was all that they could do to keep walking, their fingers trailing along the left-hand side of the walls, endlessly. In their stupor, they turned the corner and was presented with a treasure vault, a gleaming, beautiful abundance of coins and jewelry, piled high on either side of the hallway, so that they walked through the valley canyon, surrounded by walls of gold. Yet all his life, Drivlin had never seen so much wealth. Umi turned to him, her eyes stern. Your turn, fat man. I don't get my food, and you don't get the gold. Drivlin barely bit back a number of responses. Chief amongst them is that if you eat, you're hungry tomorrow, but if you steal, you're fed for a life. Very few people appreciated his philosophy on the matter of theft, despite how true it was. Still, odds were this poxy gold would vanish as soon as he left the tower. Reluctantly dropping a few coins that he'd already slipped into his hand, and nervously chuckling as Umi glared at him, he plodded along behind her as they carried on through the vault, watching the priceless treasures, a glass and silver recreation of Imperial Palace, the octagonal seal carved into lupus lazuli with a golden dragon perched atop, a falcon of onyx lined the precious jewels in every feather, slipping by, and as they turned the corner they came face to face with a grisly creature. It had no skin, it had no blood, only pale pink muscles and a gutted fish. It might have been a human once, but its arms were incredibly long, and its fingers were curved blades that scraped along as it sat, with knees curled at its chest and those terrible claws pressed against each cheek, an expression of horror. It didn't move. It was quite still, maybe dead, but Drivlin's heart had already skipped several beats, his breathing only resuming when Umi grabbed his hand and tugged him forward, whispering, "Come on!" and a rushed hiss. They picked up the way, carefully and fearfully, around the thing where it sat, and started to run. The gold canyon continued on behind the beast. Ahead was a door loomed. And Drivlin had a thought. There was no guardian, and then the treasure itself was the challenge. Definitely, if there was no guardian, he couldn't take any treasure. But since there was a guardian, didn't that mean that the treasure itself wasn't trapped, that it needed guarding? The door was just ahead of them. They could make it through in a heartbeat. Casually reaching out, he snatched up a golden telescope ringed in emeralds and patterned in tortoise-shell marks, the kinds a captain of steam should have. Umi spun around and glared at him. Her face went from a feral snarl, ready to yell, to slack pale look. Drivlin spun around. The guardian was gone, nowhere to be seen. Just vanished. Go! He roared, and they both dived for the door. It refused to budge as his hands caught the knob and turned. A hidden panel dropped back and rotated away, revealing a hidden lock of an 8-sided socket. Brack! They shouted in unison, and that was when he heard the chiming of thousands of coins crashing to the ground. End of chapter. Chapter 2.7 Freak Show. Sufi Holfand was preparing for coronation. There would be no ceremony, no crown, but in the quiet company of those who mattered, she would be made the queen of the city today. She wore her hair braided and her best tunic of crushed red velvet, with dark ruffled sleeves and a dress of pleated white. A glove covered her unsightly hand, and her mother fussed over the smallest of details. All of it was deeply unnecessary. If she had it her way, she would wear a plate mail and a sword. To her mother, today was a day about finally being accepted back into the world of power. To Sophie, today was about the blunt fact that she had beaten them all. So she wore a fancy dress and an iron glove riveted at the knuckles with a brute instrument, a threat of the rain to come. She held out her arm, and the two birds made thin twigs and stretched leather fluttering down. They were macabre little things, skeletal, the framework of the bones jutting out against the thin layer of flesh. They had singular cyclopean eyes, gaudy jewels set in the coffee-colored skin. But undeniably they were the work of a dungeon. No mortal mage could design a golem that worked without every inch of its body being imprinted with spellwork. Here not a single golden line was evident to give motion to the false flesh of artificial bones. They perched on her gauntlet, obedient to her orders. That, too, would be an excellent example. Trivlin heard the coins scatter to the ground. He braced himself for the worst. But no attack came, no trap descended, there was only the retreating sounds of claws scraping on coins clinking, which worried him more than anything. "You idiot!" Umi hissed, punching the door. That was when the lights went out. The constant pervasive glow that followed them around for the last 3 days was suddenly gone. And what was left? Only the faint luminescence coming from the doorway. It was a pale, eerie light, bringing out some cold and cruel in the glint of gold. Trivlin paused and then began to stuff his pockets frantically with coins. Really, that's where your mind is. Either they vanish and we leave the tower, or I'm the richest man in Colton tonight. I'll take those odds. He draped a necklace over his head, plucking rings onto them as he made them clanking armor of gold. And they settled him with a sudden dark and the knowledge that he would have to go out there. That the only way out was now to face down that awful skinless corpse. It felt good to know that he was fighting for someone better than his life. He was fighting for the life of a rich man. Wait a second. Recollection flashed through his mind in a sudden sparking moment. He turned back. The octagonal socket that had opened in the door. I saw... Come with me. He crept down the hallway, and every step taking him further from the door's thin light and deeper into the shadows. As he peeked around the corner, he half expected to face to face with the thing, with its awful lipless smile. Instead, there was only emptiness and a collapsed mountain of gold coins spread across the floor. He rushed over and sifted his fingers through the scattering of treasures. Nothing. Gone. Taken. "Damn it!" Trivlin muttered. "Care to tell me what's going on?" The test wasn't to ignore the treasure. It was to keep our senses in the middle of it. The key was right here. A little octagonal thing made of gemstones. There was a dragon on top. I saw it and... He raised his hands and got a gold rain down before his fingers in despair. That little cretinous thing took it away. It's not coming for us. It's making us come to it. Well, she cuffed him across the head hard enough to make his ears ring. If you do something stupid like that, I'll strip you naked and tie you up the monster bait. Understand? Now, let's move. Unless that table shows up again, there's only so long until we starve. She stormed past, wishing a rod cast over her shoulder, and Trivlin was blinking. Strip and tie him up, eh? He sensed the ticklings of affection in it bone. Climbing to his feet, he took a jeweled ceremonial dagger from amongst the riches, stowing it through his belt. It was time to hunt. There was a reason I chose kobolds, despite not having the kindest of thoughts towards them. When my creatures approached the earthen manor wells, the presence of so much foreign mana completely overwhelmed my control of them. Even creatures imbued with shards quickly lost their connection to me. Despite this, I had no trouble getting creatures to delve into the geode layers and be changed by the mana. In fact, I was having that exact opposite problem. By the time the first stone spinner spider emerged, burrowing its way up through the gap, it was no longer small enough to fit through. It was a greedy creature, had devoured the entirety of the mana reserve. Being dungeon creatures, I suppose it made sense that they had a natural hunting instinct for mana. If I wanted to experiment further, then I would need creatures capable of following orders and not reliant on crude instinct. Creatures with opposable thumbs that could bring me back samples of the earthen mana to experiment on. I even hoped to mine away some of the crystals and see what could be done with them. In short, I needed the little runts, even as they drove me half mad with their incessant hooting and playfulness. They were like children, slightly less hideous, but just as loud. Irritated, I turned my attention away, focusing on other aspects. The fourth island was in the middle one, the low point in the U-curve formed by the chain of 7. On it, the 2 enormous trees of rusting iron held back the earthen lizard. The beast slumped in captivity. Not even breathing caused it to move. The distance, it looked like nothing more than a spike-ridged hill of stone and dirt, lashed by change for some mysterious reason. In the dark of the night-veined trees, by the time they saw the draconic form hidden inside the rubble, it would be too late. A trophy and a defender, this floor, with its blessing of revenant spirits, would come to bear the marks of all those who tried to conquer my domain. The beast was just the first. The next island was the 5th, split completely in half by the deep crevasse from which the earthen lizard had erupted, the sides of the chasm glittering with earth crystals. Somewhere below, the mother lode of earthen matter awaited. Unfortunately, it was very presence interfering with my powers, so I was unable to build a way down to my creations, much less a way back. For now I merely needed to defend it. I had assault golems prowling this area, but they hardly fit the theme. The strange, mournful atmosphere of the weeping trees and the night fruits, of the creeping flesh vines and the rust-red undertones amongst the grey flowers. They required something more. I needed something truly frightening to dissuade greedy hands from my treasure trove. I began selecting the bright claw rats from my 4th schema, the sudden rush of clarity encoding every detail in the form of my mind, and allowed me to shape it much more cleverly. What I would do next would blur the limits of the rodent form. First, I needed to make it big, the size of a large hound at least. I stripped away the fur and turned the flesh into a bruisey electric blue shade, layering over it with a patchwork of scales in dark dull red. What resulted was a repeating diamond pattern of 2 colors, a lattice work, and I made spines rise up from the backs of its elbows, elongating each limb until it could move with a lithe grace and swift as an arrow. A ridge of long spikes protruding from its line on its back. But that wasn't enough. I added tendrils, long waving things tipped by flat, oval-shaped pads that tiny hooks allowed to grasp onto things by coating the pads inwards. The overall effect was like the mouth of a Venus flytrap. I pushed back the skin on its face, letting its long, sharp jaws protrude out in a display of pale bone. It looked as if its face was poorly made mask, being peeled away to reveal the horror of teeth and yellow ivory beneath it. I gave it tusks, and I gave it a long, slavering tongue, and I gave it a name. Rat Hound of Lament. Born of strange inspiration, this beast carries itself with the predator's grace. Its unwieldy form invokes terror and awe of those that see it. And then I felt oddly dizzy, a wrenching, churning sensation, as if the world was spinning around me and I had nothing to hold on to. No doubt, if I'd been a human, I would have done something messy and horribly organic. What was that? As I came to, I looked on in horror as what I had made. What had possessed me to do such a thing? Where was the beauty, the art? It was a horror. End of chapter. Chapter 2.8. Poisoned. My world turned and spun in the most nauseating way, leaving me adrift and confused. The rat hound I created took its first steps into the world, moving with a hideous, sinuous kind of grace, as if there were no bones beneath the mottled skin. It prowled on the 5th island, its tongue slithering out of it, tasting air. Salt and iron together, they made the scent of blood. It amused itself by putting its body to work, by running, slithering, leaping. It was an unruly thing in body and mind. The rat hound was a deadly creature, all spines and exposed teeth. Its form was a chimeric agglomeration of lethal things, tusks, tendrils, artlessly crushed together into one body whose basic grace was strained under the load. There was a certain way in which almost all natural creatures were beautiful, in that they were efficient, sleek little machines, whittled by years of adaptation to a singular purpose. The rat hound looked like a child's clumsy idea of a monster, and I had created it. Me. I'd hoped anyone could see that it made no sense. In the one short month of my existence, I had proven myself a paragon of taste, at least, and I was more than my reason to be. It made me better than some animal in the dark, luring humans down to kill them by the drink of their souls. I felt sick. My world continued to spin. Something here was bad, bad, bad. I felt a simple wrongness to the core of my being. This had to be nipped in the bud. Kill it. The entirety of my dungeon stirred at the command. Even Arum lifted his head, and the salt columns huffed, pawing the ground. The rat hound sensed the sudden shift in the air. Darting back too slowly, the salt rhino had already dipped its horn down, and, with a sudden kick, it burst chugging, galloping motion, sweeping towards the unwanted pest. The beast curved its boneless body, twisting and feinting left and right, and suddenly left again, disorienting the crude golem into rushing past. As the rhino did, a suckered tendril raked across its side. The wound was nothing, barely a scratch, but it was lethal nonetheless. I could feel the mana pathways that animated the golem start to crumble and decay, unwillingly, until the very energy that came from the stalled statue to life was crashing about within its body, an uncontrolled flame. I hesitated. The second golem lunged forward, and again the matador show of agility sent it hurtling off in the wrong direction as the rat hound ducked aside. It was almost playing with them. They kicked up a huge clouds of dust as they turned, clumsy, straggling against their own momentum. Grit bellowed through the air as they sought to find the enemy, to crush it beneath its bulk. The rat hound was never there, always a step ahead, ripping at them with the shallow cuts and some strange poison that I didn't understand. The first salt golem collapsed suddenly, falling apart mid-rush so that its own momentum carried it into a spray of salt chunks, going tumbling along the ground. The rat hound leapt up on the second, clawing at its back viciously. As I refused to watch this play out any further, to watch the second fall to chaos again. A little fear flashed through me as I remembered what the rat hound had been made to guard, what it could very well steal, the wellspring of earthen mana. I needed to stop this before it vanished down into the earth where neither my minions nor my sight could reach it. Arum didn't need to be told. The unwound from around me, slithering out from the great mouth of the weeping tree emerged. An uncoiling weight of golden scales, feathers, insect claws. His mouth opened in a long, rattling hiss of challenge. The rat hound answered a flaming hiss, dropping away from the salt column as one, too, began to crumble and fall apart. Under the canopy of Orum's leafy green scales, it was nothing, a tiny speck of flesh. It turned supplely, eyeing out the rift down the earthen wellspring. Orum's tail struck out before it could even return its attention to him. The whip-crack blur of gold-streaked scales, like a green bolt of lightning, smashed against the beast's side and flicked through the air. It returned to the ground in a long arc, skidding and rolling. Already Arum had slithered to the tide between the hound and escape, cutting off its route into the rift on earthen mana. It climbed onto its feet, one leg held weakly, limping. Again that hissing war cry. It braced itself and charged for Arum, head lowering, doing just what the salt golems had done. Arum's jaw snapped open, and the gout of flame came bursting, sparkling, boiling up, and a brilliant jet of flames that roared out in a fury, drifting sparks and leaping golden fire. I watched the hound reduced to a shadow within that brilliance, crumbling away. The time it was done, there was nothing left but a crisp ash and charcoal that curled in the ground. But I felt sick with worry. What had that been? Why had its very touch been so deadly to golems? It was like a poison to the mana within them. Poison. I hurriedly pulled back the senses into myself and turned my attention inwards to my core. The ever-turning arrangement of 5 golden diagrams lined the countless runes that together orbited continued, and the rift no larger than a fingernail, through which an endless mana poured. It was as bad as I feared. The outermost ring, the attunement of disguise, was starting to fray. The diagrams were askew, the clean geometric lines were warping and bending. Sparks of purplish, bruising light darted around the ring, like embers from a fire. As I watched, a portion of the runic designs crumbled away into yet more sparks of purple light. And there was nothing I could do about it. My core was the one place that I had no power to change. None at all. Nothing I could do or will would affect those fired rings, which existed to bind me as much as they did to strengthen me. I was helpless now to anything but to watch the damage slowly spread, hypnotized by the sight of my own inner workings crumbling away like so much dust. Too long was spent in fascinated horror at my own mortality before I realized that it was something I could do. The motes of bruised light were nothing more than mana, after all, and so I created the simplest, most harmless thing that I could think of in the moment. A flower. And I emptied my reserves into it. A black orchid bloomed. The feeling of being completely short of mana was one that I hadn't experienced in a long time. My cloud of ethereal energies that let me see throughout the dungeon had begun to break apart. And I was blind, deaf, and in a blank world of my own as I waited to recover, my mind woozy with exertion. But it had worked, at least to slow the bleeding. All the sparks of poisonous mana were drawn away, thrust into the flower instead. I would have to been elated if that couldn't see how much damage had already been done. The structure of the outermost ring, the first achievement that I had chosen for myself, had begun to crumble apart. And that process couldn't easily be reversed. I came back into the world, my ethereal senses slowly expanding again as the ambient mana flowed from me. I found that I was being prodded, concerned by a little kobold who let out a happy bark as I sent waves of reassurance to its simple little mind. Everything will be fine. But I wasn't so sure. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.